Renwick stood at the edge of the woodshed her husband built with his own hands, and the padlock on the door felt heavier than it should. Everyone in town said the shed held nothing but scrap lumber and rusted tools. Skye knew better. 12 years of marriage had taught her that Osric never locked anything without a reason, and the note tucked into her coat pocket, written in his handwriting, told her tonight was the night to find out why. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Skye Renwick had been sitting at her kitchen table in Millbrook Cove, a small fishing town on the coast of Maine, staring at a letter from Coastal Trust Bank. She read it once, then twice. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times her eyes passed over them. 45 days to bring the mortgage current, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the house and the 2 acres behind it, including the woodshed where her husband had spent almost every evening of their marriage. Skye was 40 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months, and some mornings she still reached across the bed before remembering. Osric had died on a Tuesday in March, working under a boat hull at the marina where he did repairs for half the fishing fleet in the cove. A support beam gave way. It was fast, the paramedics told her later, though she never understood how anyone could know that for certain or why it was supposed to bring comfort. He was 43. They had been married 12 years, together for 15. No children, not for lack of wanting them, but 2 miscarriages in their 30s had closed that door quietly, without either of them ever saying so out loud. What they had instead was each other, this house, and Osric's woodworking, which had gone from hobby to trade to something closer to obsession in the last several years of his life. He fixed boats for a living. Everyone in Millbrook Cove knew him for that. Fewer people knew about the furniture he built on the side, the cabinets, the hand-carved chests he sold at the county fair every autumn for extra money during the lean winter months. Even fewer knew what he did in the shed after dark, because Osric had always kept that door locked and had always given the same explanation when Skye asked. "It's dangerous in there, Skye," he'd say. "Sawdust everywhere, blades I haven't put away right. You'd hate it. Stick to your garden and let me have my mess." She'd laughed it off for years. It was such a small thing, one closed door in an otherwise open marriage, and she had her own spaces too, her painting studio in the spare room, the raised beds out back where she grew tomatoes nobody else in the family could stand to eat because of how much garlic she put in everything. Marriages need a little privacy, her mother used to say. Skye had believed that, right up until the debt collector's letters started arriving, and she realized just how much Osric had never told her. The debt had been accumulating for years before he died. A boat repair business is unpredictable, dependent on weather and luck, and which engines decide to fail in a given season. Osric had taken out loans against the house twice, once for a new roof, once for equipment Skye didn't fully understand. He'd made the payments quietly, without complaint, and she had trusted that he had it handled, because he always had it handled, until the accident, and the life insurance that turned out to be smaller than either of them had planned for, and the slow realization that Skye was going to lose the house her husband built with his hands. She'd tried. She'd taken a second job at the hardware store in town, sold the truck, cut every expense she could find. It bought her time, not enough. Coastal Trust Bank had been patient in the way institutions are patient, which is to say not particularly. A loan officer named Nolan Braithwaite had come to the house twice in the last month, always polite, always finding a new way to explain that patience had limits and that Skye's situation, as he put it, was simply the numbers working the way numbers work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Skye had gone through the house room by room over those 3 weeks, packing what she'd need to keep, deciding what she'd have to sell. It was in Osric's closet, behind a row of flannel shirts she couldn't bring herself to donate yet, that she found the cedar box she'd never seen before. Inside was a single iron key, old and cold in her palm, and a folded piece of paper in handwriting she would have known anywhere. "Skye," it read, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I never got to explain the shed the way I should have. There's a journal in there, locked in the bottom drawer of my workbench. The key in this box opens both. Don't go in until you need to. And Skye, when you do go in, you're going to be angry with me for a while before you understand. I'm sorry for that. I did it because I loved you more than I knew how to say out loud. She sat on the floor of the closet for a long time after reading it, the key pressed into her palm hard enough to leave a mark, the flannel shirt still smelling faintly of cedar and sawdust above her head. Outside, the wind off the water was picking up, and rain had started against the window, the kind of cold spring rain that Millbrook Cove got more of than anywhere else Skye had ever lived. She thought about the shed at the edge of the yard, dark and locked and waiting, exactly the way it had waited for 15 years while she'd been told to stay away for her own good. Whatever Osric had hidden in there, she was done waiting for permission to know. Skye crossed the backyard toward the shed with the iron key gripped so tightly it had left a groove in her palm. Rain had softened into a mist by then, the kind that clung to hair and eyelashes without ever quite feeling like weather. She had walked this same path 1,000 times over 12 years, carrying Osric coffee on cold mornings, calling him in for dinner when he lost track of time, and never once had she gone past the threshold of that door. The shed looked smaller than she remembered it, though she knew that wasn't true. Cedar shingles, gone gray with salt air and age, covered the outside walls. A single window sat high up near the roofline, curtained from the inside with a piece of canvas Osric had tacked up years ago. Skye had asked about that curtain once, early in their marriage. He'd told her the afternoon sun ruined his eyes when he was working close on detail cuts. She believed him. She believed most things he told her, which was starting to feel less like trust now and more like something she hadn't examined closely enough. The padlock was old, the kind with a keyhole instead of a combination dial, rusted at the edges but well-oiled where the mechanism actually turned. That detail caught her attention. Osric must have kept it maintained, must have opened and closed this lock regularly enough to keep it from seizing. 15 years of evenings. 15 years of this exact motion. Key in a lock, click, door swinging open onto whatever waited inside. Her hand shook when she fit the key into the slot. It turned easily, smoother than she expected, and the lock released with a small metallic sound that felt enormous in the quiet of the yard. Skye pulled the padlock free and set it on the ground beside her boot. Then she gripped the door handle and pushed. It didn't open right away. Osric had built the shed sturdy, the way he built everything, and the door had swollen slightly with the damp coastal air. Skye pushed harder, bracing her shoulder against the wood, and it gave all at once, swinging inward with a groan that startled a gull off the fence line behind her. Darkness greeted her first, then the smell. Cedar and linseed oil, sawdust and something else underneath it, ink maybe, or old paper. Skye fumbled for the light switch just inside the door frame, her fingers finding it from memory even though she'd never used it, and a single bare bulb overhead flickered twice before catching. The inside of the shed was nothing like she'd pictured. For 15 years she had imagined chaos, the mess Osric always described, tools scattered and blades left dangerous on every surface. What she found instead was order so precise it looked almost military. A long workbench ran the length of the far wall, its surface clear except for a single vise and a row of chisels arranged by size. Pegboard covered the wall above it. Every tool hung in its place, outlined in pencil so nothing would ever go missing or be returned wrong. Shelves lined the other walls, and on them sat pieces Skye had never seen before. Small carved boxes, some finished and gleaming, others half done. A violin body, ribs bent and glued, but not yet strung. Drawings pinned up in neat rows. Technical sketches with measurements written in Osric's cramped handwriting, the same handwriting from the note in her pocket. This wasn't a workshop for boat repairs or county fair furniture. This was something Osric had built for himself, and only for himself. Over years she hadn't known to count. Skye walked slowly along the workbench, running her fingers over the smooth edge of a half-finished box, careful not to disturb anything, as if the shed itself might notice she was there and decide to close back up around her. At the far end of the bench sat a squat wooden cabinet with 3 drawers. The top 2 opened easily when she tried them, revealing sandpaper, glue, small tins of stain and shade she couldn't name. The bottom drawer didn't move at all. A small brass keyhole sat centered above the handle, and when Skye pulled the same iron key from her pocket and tried it, it slid in and turned without resistance. The drawer opened onto a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft at the corners from handling. a length of twine wrapped twice around it to keep it shut. Skye lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, thick with pages, and something else was tucked inside the back cover, a bulge she could feel through the leather but couldn't yet identify. She sat down on Osric's stool, the journal resting in her lap, rain starting to pick up again against the small window above her. For a long moment she just held it, feeling the twine under her thumb, listening to the sound of the shed settling around her the way old wood does in weather. 15 years of locked doors had led to this single object, and Skye wasn't sure anymore whether she was more afraid of what was written inside, or of how much of her husband she had never actually known. Skye untied the twine with fingers that didn't want to cooperate, and the leather cover fell open across her lap. The first page held no date, no introduction, just Osric's handwriting filling every line edge to edge, the same slant she'd read on grocery lists and anniversary cards for 15 years, except here it looked different somehow, more careful, like he'd known someday someone else would need to make sense of it. Skye, if you're reading this, you found the shed, and I imagine you're furious with me right now, and you have every right to be. I kept something from you for almost our entire marriage, and I don't have a good enough reason, only the reason that made sense to me at the time, which was that I wanted this to be a gift and not a burden. Read the rest before you decide how angry to stay. She turned the page. The entries that followed weren't dated like a normal diary. They read more like notes to himself. Technical observations mixed with something closer to confession. And Skye found herself reading faster than she meant to, hungry for whatever came next even as her chest tightened with every line. The first real entry explained how it started. Osric had grown up 2 towns over from Millbrook Cove, and as a teenager he'd worked summers for an old man named Anton Merrick, a Czech immigrant who repaired stringed instruments out of a garage that smelled permanently of resin and turpentine. Merrick had no children of his own, and Osric, restless and good with his hands even then, had become something like an apprentice without either of them ever using that word for it. Merrick taught him the old methods, the ones passed down through generations of Central European luthiers, the exact ratios for varnish, the way to read grain in a block of maple before you ever touched a blade to it. When Merrick died, Osric had been 22, newly married, and the old man left him something in his will that Osric had never told Skye about. Not money, a crate. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth and packed with sawdust for cushioning, were pieces of aged tonewood that Merrick had been collecting for decades, spruce from a specific forest in Bosnia that had stopped being harvested for instrument making after a fire in the 1960s, and maple cut from trees that no longer existed in that quantity or quality anywhere in Europe. Alongside the wood sat a notebook of Marek's own, written half in Czech and half in English, containing his personal formula for varnish, a formula he claimed traced back to techniques used by luthiers in Cremona centuries earlier, passed hand to hand through a chain of teachers Merrick refused to name specifically, as if naming them might somehow break the thread. Osric had written in the journal that he didn't fully understand what he'd inherited at the time. He knew it was valuable in some way, knew it mattered to Merrick enormously, but he was young and the marriage was new and money was tight, and it would have been easy to sell the wood to a dealer for a quick sum and move on with his life. He almost did it. There was an entry describing a phone call with a dealer in Boston who offered him $4,000 for the entire crate, sight unseen, based only on Osric's description over the phone. I didn't take it, the entry read. Something in me knew that $4,000 wasn't the real number. And something else in me, something I couldn't have explained to you back then, told me I wasn't ready to let go of the last thing Merrick gave me. So I kept it, and then I started building. Skye lowered the journal for a moment, looking across the shed at the violin body sitting on the shelf, ribs bent into that graceful curve, waiting for a neck and strings it had never received. 15 years, and Osric had never mentioned a single word of any of this. Not the apprenticeship, not Merrick, not a crate of rare wood sitting in this shed the entire time they'd lived in this house together. She kept reading. The journal jumped forward across years, tracking a slow, obsessive education. Osric had taught himself everything Merrick hadn't gotten to teach him before he died, reading old texts, corresponding by mail with luthiers in Europe who specialized in historical reconstruction, ruining pieces of the precious wood over and over until he understood how to work with it properly. He built failures for a decade, practiced instruments, mediocre by his own harsh judgment, sold quietly to music teachers and students for modest sums, just enough to fund more materials and keep the secret self-contained. Then, 7 years ago, he had started on something different. An entry dated only with a season, late autumn, described it plainly enough that Skye had to read it twice to understand what she was looking at. "I'm going to try to build one true instrument," the entry read. Not a copy of something existing, but a violin made exactly the way Merrick would have wanted, using everything he left me, everything he taught me, everything I've learned since trying to be worthy of what he gave me. If it works, it will be worth more than either of us ever imagined. If it doesn't, at least I'll have tried, and you'll never have to know I failed at something this strange and this personal. Skye's hands were shaking again by the time she finished the page. Somewhere in this shed, or somewhere else entirely, there was an instrument her husband had spent years of secret evenings building. An instrument he believed could be worth a fortune, and she had never once suspected any of it existed until tonight. Skye set the journal down on the edge of the workbench and stood, her knees stiff from sitting so long on the low stool. If Osric had spent 7 years building something in this shed, it had to still be here, and yet she'd already looked across every shelf without seeing anything that matched what the journal described. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the space again with new eyes, until she noticed what she'd missed the first time. A section of the back wall, behind the shelving unit closest to the window, looked slightly off from the rest, the wood grain running a different direction than the boards around it. She pulled the shelf away from the wall as far as its bracket would allow, and found a seam she wouldn't have noticed otherwise, a nearly invisible panel cut into the wall itself, fitted so precisely it barely showed as a line. There was no lock on it, only a small recessed groove where a fingernail could catch and pull. Skye worked her fingers into the gap, and the panel swung outward, revealing a shallow compartment built into the wall's frame, lined in the same soft cloth Osric had used to wrap the wood Merrick left him. Inside, resting on a bed of folded velvet, was the violin. Skye had seen instruments before, at school concerts, in shop windows, but nothing prepared her for what sat in front of her now. The wood had a depth to its color that seemed to shift under the single overhead bulb, amber near the edges deepening toward a reddish-brown at the center, the grain visible beneath layers of varnish, so fine it looked less like a coating and more like something that had grown there naturally. The scroll at the top of the neck was carved into a shape she didn't recognize from any violin she'd ever seen. Not the usual spiral, but something closer to a small, precise wave, cut with a confidence that told her this had not been Osric's first attempt at that particular detail, whatever it was called. She lifted it out with both hands, careful the way she imagined a person should be careful with something like this, though nobody had ever taught her how. It was lighter than she expected, and when she turned it under the light, she saw a small paper label glued inside through the F-hole, barely legible, written in the same handwriting as the journal. Made by Osric Renwick in memory of Anton Merrick, using wood and knowledge given to me by a man who believed I could become something more than I was. Finished this year, after 7 years of trying, for reasons I hope my wife will one day understand. Skye held the violin against her chest without meaning to, the way a person holds something fragile and irreplaceable, and felt tears come before she could stop them. She carried it carefully back to the stool and sat down again, the instrument resting across her knees, and reached for the journal to keep reading, needing to understand the rest of it now more than she needed anything else in the world at that moment. The final entries were shorter, written closer together in time, as if Osric had known something the rest of them hadn't known yet. One described finishing the varnish, the last of 17 coats applied over 8 months, each one requiring weeks to cure properly before the next could go on. Another described stringing the instrument for the first time and playing a single note, badly, since Osric had never learned to actually play, just to hear what all those years had produced. "It sounds like something Merrick would recognize," the entry read. "I don't know how to explain that any better than that. It sounds old in a way that has nothing to do with age." The last entry in the journal was different from the rest, addressed directly to Skye rather than written as a private note to himself. "If you're reading this, something happened to me before I could tell you all of this properly, and I need you to know a few things. First, I'm sorry. I should have shown you the shed years ago, should have let you watch this happen instead of hiding it, but somewhere along the way, keeping it secret became its own habit, and I told myself I was protecting you from years of worry over an instrument that might never amount to anything. Second, this violin is not just sentimental. I've stayed in contact with people who know this world, people who understand what Marek's wood and Marek's methods are actually worth, and I believe if it's real, if everything I've done here holds up, this instrument could be worth a significant amount of money. Enough to matter. Enough to matter a great deal, if you ever needed it to. There is a name and a phone number folded into the back cover of this journal. A man named Julian Voss who used to work with Marek and who I've spoken with a handful of times over the years without ever telling him the instrument was finished. If you ever need to understand what this is worth, start with him. Trust him more than you'll trust anyone else who comes asking about it, because everyone else who comes asking will only want to take it from you for less than it's worth. I love you, Sky. Everything in this shed, all of it, every year I spent out here after you'd gone to bed, was for you, even when I didn't know how to say so. Sky reached into the back cover and found the folded slip of paper exactly where Osric said it would be, a name and a number written in a different hand than his own. She sat there a long while, the violin across her knees, rain drumming steady against the small window overhead, and thought about how strange it was to grieve a man twice in 14 months, once for the loss of him, and now again for everything about him she was only now beginning to know. Morning came gray and salt-scented, the way most mornings did in Millbrook Cove, and Sky sat at her kitchen table with the violin case Osric had also built, tucked away behind the same false panel, resting closed in front of her. She'd found the case near dawn, after hours of reading and rereading the journal, a fitted wooden box lined in the same velvet as the wall compartment, built specifically to hold this one instrument and nothing else. She hadn't slept. She wasn't sure she'd wanted to. The slip of paper with Julian Voss's number sat propped against the sugar bowl, and Sky had already picked up her phone twice and set it back down without dialing. It was one thing to read Osric's instructions in the quiet of the shed at midnight. It was another thing entirely to call a stranger and say she had something that might be worth, in Osric's words, a significant amount of money, without any real sense of what that meant or whether she could trust her own judgment about any of it. She was still working up the nerve when a car pulled into her driveway. Through the kitchen window, she recognized the dark green sedan belonging to Nolan Braithwood, the loan officer from Coastal Trust, and her stomach tightened in a way that had become familiar over the last month. He knocked twice, polite as always, and Sky opened the door only far enough to see him properly. "Mrs. Renwick," he said, "I won't take much of your time. I was in the area and wanted to check in, see how you're doing with everything." Sky didn't invite him in. Behind him, out past the driveway, the shed door stood slightly open where she'd left it the night before, and she watched his eyes drift toward it before he caught himself and brought his attention back to her. "You've got a lot of activity out there," Braithwood said, nodding toward the shed. "Didn't realize that old place was still in use. I always figured it for storage." "It's fine," Sky said. "Just going through my husband's things." "Understandable." He shifted his weight, the way people do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "Mrs. Renwick, I want you to know the bank isn't trying to be difficult here. But we are 31 days out now, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't ask whether you've thought about what happens if you can't bring the account current in that window. There are options that might ease things. Voluntary sale of certain assets, for instance, could go a long way towards showing good faith to the loan committee." Sky felt something harden in her chest. "What kind of assets?" "Whatever you've got of value," he said, his tone still even, still reasonable sounding. "That shed, for one. Old tools, equipment, that sort of thing can add up if you know who to sell it to. I've got a contact, actually, a man who deals in estate items, antiques, things of that nature. Might be worth having him take a look before you make any decisions on your own." Sky said she'd think about it, mostly to get him off her porch, and watched his car pull back down the gravel drive with a feeling she couldn't quite name, somewhere between suspicion and exhaustion. She didn't like how quickly his eyes had gone to the shed. She didn't like how casually he'd mentioned a contact, as if he already had someone lined up before she'd said a single word about what was inside. That contact showed up 2 days later. His name was Desmond Croy, and he arrived in a car too expensive for the roads around Millbrook Cove, dressed like a man who wanted people to notice the quality of his coat before they noticed anything else about him. He introduced himself on Sky's porch with a business card already extended, antique appraisals and estate liquidation printed under his name in a font trying hard to look old-fashioned. "Nolan mentioned you might have some items worth looking at," Croy said. "I specialize in exactly this kind of situation, Widows, estates, families needing to move quickly. I promise you I'm fair, and I'm fast, which matters more than people realize when a deadline's involved. Skye hesitated at the door, and against every instinct telling her not to, she found herself thinking of the violin sitting locked in its case inside the house, and wondering, cautiously, whether showing it to someone who claimed to know value might tell her something useful before she called the number Osric left her. She led Croy not to the shed, but into the living room, where she'd moved the case the night before, and set it on the coffee table between them. When she opened it, Croy's expression flickered, just barely, before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. He leaned forward, studied the instrument without touching it, ran his eyes along the scroll, the varnish, the label visible through the F-hole, and Skye watched him carefully, the way Osric's journal had told her to watch anyone who came asking. "Homemade," Croy said, finally leaning back. "Nicely done for an amateur build, I'll give you that. But instruments like this, without a documented maker, without provenance from a recognized workshop, they don't hold real value on the collector market. I could offer you $1,500, maybe $2,000 if I'm feeling generous, mostly for the wood itself if someone wants to salvage it for parts." Skye said nothing for a moment, thinking of the journal upstairs, of Marek's wood from a forest that no longer existed, of 7 years and 17 coats of varnish, and a scroll carved into a shape she still didn't have a name for. $1,500. She thought of Braithwaite's casual mention of a contact, of how quickly this man had arrived once the bank pointed him in her direction, of how sure he seemed that she wouldn't know any better. "That's a very specific number for something you just said has no documented value," Skye said. Croy's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "I'm simply being honest with you, Mrs. Renwick. In your situation, with the timeline you're facing, an offer like mine is worth taking seriously. These opportunities don't stay on the table forever." Skye closed the case, latched it, and stood, and it took everything in her not to let her hands shake while she did it. "I think I need more time to think it over," she said, and showed him to the door, and stood in her front hallway afterward listening to his car pull away, certain now, more than she'd been certain of anything in weeks, that whatever this violin actually was, it was worth a great deal more than $2,000, and that the men circling her house already knew it. Skye waited until the house was quiet again before she picked up the slip of paper by the sugar bowl and finally dialed the number written in Marek's careful, foreign hand. It rang 4 times before a man answered, his voice older, unhurried, faintly accented in a way that made her think immediately of the entries in Osric's journal. "Julian Voss," the voice said. Skye introduced herself, explained who her husband had been, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line before Voss spoke again, and when he did, his voice had changed entirely, sharpened with an attention she hadn't expected. "Osric Renwick," he said. "Anton's boy. I wondered, more than once over the years, whether he'd ever finish it. He called me maybe 6 times since Anton passed, always asking questions, never quite telling me how far along he'd gotten. Are you saying it's done? Are you saying you have it in front of you right now?" Skye told him everything then, the shed, the journal, the false panel in the wall, the violin resting in its case in her living room. Voss listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked if he could see it in person as soon as possible, and something in the urgency of the request told Skye this wasn't ordinary curiosity. He arrived the next afternoon, having driven 4 hours from a workshop outside Boston where he restored and appraised instruments for auction houses and private collectors along the East Coast. He was younger than Skye expected, maybe 60, with the kind of hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime doing careful, precise work. He stood in her doorway for a moment before he even said hello, staring past her toward the living room, as though he could already sense the instrument was there. "May I?" he asked, and Skye led him to the case and opened it. Voss didn't touch the violin right away. He crouched beside it, studying it from several angles, the way Croy had, except nothing about his expression was practiced or neutral. His hands hovered over the scroll without landing, and Skye watched something that looked almost like grief pass over his face. "Anton designed that scroll pattern himself," he said quietly. "I haven't seen it carved correctly by anyone since he died. He tried to teach it to me once. I never had the patience for it." He lifted the instrument then, turning it slowly under the living room light, checking the label through the F-hole, running one finger along the edge of the varnish without pressing hard enough to mark it. He asked Skye if he could take measurements, and she nodded. And for the next 2 hours she watched him work with a small kit of tools he'd brought from his car, calipers and a jeweler's loupe and a notebook of his own where he recorded numbers she didn't understand. When he finally sat back, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Renwick, I need to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want to overstate it before proper documentation and testing confirm what I believe. But the wood grain pattern matches photographs Anton showed me decades ago of the Bosnian spruce he was so protective of. The varnish formula, if it's what I think it is, hasn't been reliably reproduced by more than a handful of makers in the world, and most of those makers are dead now too. And the workmanship itself, Osric's workmanship, is extraordinary. This isn't an amateur instrument. This is the work of someone who trained properly, even if he trained in secret, in a shed, without anyone in the profession ever knowing his name." "What does that mean?" Skye asked, "for what it's worth?" Voss set the violin carefully back into its case before he answered. "If everything holds up under formal appraisal, and I believe it will, you're looking at an instrument that could sell at auction for somewhere between $400,000 and $700,000. Possibly more, depending on how the story around it is told. And instruments with a compelling history tend to draw significant interest from serious collectors." Skye sat down hard in the armchair across from him, her ears ringing faintly, the number too large to fit into any part of her mind that had spent the last month calculating whether she could scrape together enough for a mortgage payment. "Someone already offered me $2,000 for it," she said. Voss's expression darkened. "Someone from around here?" "A man named Desmond Croy. The bank sent him." "I'd be careful of anyone the bank sends you," Voss said. "People in Croy's line of work count on grieving families not knowing what they have. $2,000 for an instrument like this isn't an offer. It's an attempt to take advantage of you before you understand what you're holding. I've seen it happen before, more than once, and it's the reason Anton was always so guarded about who he let near his work." Skye thought of Braithwaite's casual mention of a contact, of how quickly Croy had arrived, of the smoothness in both their voices when they'd each, in their own way, tried to convince her that what she had was worth almost nothing. "What do I do now?" she asked. "If you're willing," Voss said, "I'd like to bring in a colleague for a second formal opinion, someone with no connection to me, so the appraisal carries full credibility. I can also put you in touch with an auction house that specializes in fine instruments, one that would handle the sale properly, with real security and real documentation, and get you the price this instrument deserves. But Mrs. Renwick, I want you to promise me something first." "What's that?" Skye asked. "Don't let anyone else through your door with an offer before we've finished this properly," Voss said. "Not the bank, not Croy, not anyone claiming to be in a hurry to help you. You have something rare, and rare things attract people who will try to take them before their true value is ever spoken out loud." Skye promised, and meant it, and for the first time since the letter from Coastal Trust had arrived on her kitchen table weeks earlier, she felt something other than dread settle into the space where fear had been living. Dr. Faye Ondrzejek arrived from a conservation lab in Providence 11 days later, and Skye watched her work with the same reverence Voss had shown, though she moved through her examination with a different kind of precision, methodical in a way that reminded Skye of a surgeon rather than an admirer. She spent nearly 4 hours with the violin, running tests Skye didn't fully understand, photographing the wood grain under different lights, comparing measurements against a database of historical instruments on her laptop. When she finished, she sat with Skye at the kitchen table and confirmed almost everything Voss had already told her, in language more careful and more official. The spruce was consistent with pre-1960s Bosnian tonewood, a material now essentially unobtainable through any legal channel. The varnish, when tested against known samples of Cremonese formulas passed down through documented lineages, matched closely enough that Ondrzejek was prepared to state, in writing, that it likely represented an authentic continuation of a technique believed lost outside a small circle of specialists. "This instrument deserves a formal auction listing," Ondrzejek said. "With Julian's documentation and mine together, along with the journal itself as provenance, I'd estimate a realistic range between $500,000 and $650,000, with real potential to exceed that if the right collectors take an interest in the story behind it. Instruments like this don't come up often. When they do, people pay attention." Skye had the journal photocopied that same week, every page, every entry about Merrick and the wood and the years of secret evenings, and Voss helped her prepare a formal submission to an auction house in New York that specialized in fine instruments, the kind of place that handled sales for museums and serious collectors rather than pawn shops and estate sales. The process would take time, weeks at minimum, and Sky's 45 days from Coastal Trust had already burned down to under 3 weeks by the time everything was in motion. That was when Braithwood came back. He arrived without calling first, the way he had the first time, though his manner had shifted since their last conversation, something sharper underneath the same practiced politeness. Sky met him on the porch again, arms crossed against the cold. "Mrs. Renwick, I understand Desmond came to see you a while back," he said. "He mentioned you weren't interested in his offer. I'll be honest, that surprised me, given where things stand with your account." "It wasn't a fair offer," Sky said. Braithwood's smile thinned. "With respect, I'm not sure you're in a position to know what's fair and what isn't when it comes to something like that. Desmond's been in the business 20 years. I trust his judgment on value more than I'd trust a grieving widow's. No offense intended." Sky felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level, the way Voss had told her to stay level with anyone who tried to rush her. "None taken," she said, "but I've had 2 independent experts examine the instrument since then, people with no connection to each other and no connection to you or Desmond. Their numbers were a little higher than his." Something flickered across Braithwood's face, there and gone. "How much higher?" "I'd rather not discuss specifics," Sky said, "but high enough that I won't be needing to sell anything at a discount to your friend." "Mrs. Renwick," he said, his tone hardening now, dropping the pretense of friendliness he'd worn on every prior visit. "You have 19 days left before this bank begins formal foreclosure proceedings. I'd strongly encourage you to be realistic about your timeline. Auction houses take months. Whatever fantasy figure someone's given you doesn't help you make a payment due in less than 3 weeks." "I'm aware of the timeline," Sky said. "I've already spoken with the bank's main office about a short extension, given that I have documented expert appraisals in progress and a formal auction submission underway. They were willing to discuss it. Perhaps you should check with your supervisor before you come back here again." That last part wasn't entirely true yet, though Sky had, in fact, called the bank's regional office 2 days earlier at Voss's suggestion, and had been told an extension request would be reviewed, which was enough truth to say it out loud with a straight face. Braithwood's expression made clear the shot had landed. He didn't say anything else useful after that, just muttered something about being in touch, and left faster than he'd arrived. Croy called that same evening, his voice smoother than it had been in person, clearly briefed by Braithwood on how the visit had gone. "Mrs. Renwick, I want to revisit our earlier conversation," he said. "I may have undervalued the piece initially, not having full context on its history. I'd be willing to offer $20,000. Today, cash, no waiting on auction houses or appraisals that might not pan out the way you're hoping." Sky almost laughed at how far the number had jumped in under 2 weeks, from 1,500 to 20,000, as if Croy had simply been waiting to see how much fear he could extract before revealing what he actually believed the instrument might be worth. "Mr. Croy," she said, "I appreciate the call, but I've had 2 independent, credentialed appraisers examine the violin, and their estimates are considerably higher than that. I think we're done here." There was a pause on the line, and when Croy spoke again, his voice had lost its polish. "You're making a mistake trusting strangers over people who actually know this market," he said. "That instrument could sit unsold for years. Collectors are particular. You could end up with nothing." "Then I'll take that chance," Sky said, and hung up before he could say anything else, her hands steady this time in a way they hadn't been the last time she'd closed the door on him. She sat at the kitchen table afterward with the journal open in front of her, rereading the last entry Osric had written for her, the one about trusting Voss and no one else who came asking, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with the money at all. Osric had known, somehow, that people like Braithwood and Croy would come first, would try to close the door before she understood what she was holding, and he had left her exactly what she needed to recognize them for what they were. The auction took place 7 weeks later, held by a house in New York that specialized in fine stringed instruments, in a room Sky had never imagined she'd stand inside. All soft lighting and hushed voices and buyers who flew in from places she'd only ever heard mentioned on the news. Julian Voss stood beside her near the back, and Dr. Authenticating had sent a formal letter of authentication that the auctioneer read aloud before bidding opened. along with a short account, drawn from the journal, of Anton Merrick, and the wood he'd left behind, and the 7 years Osric had spent teaching himself to be worthy of it. Skye hadn't expected to cry during the bidding itself, but she did, quietly in the back row, when the number climbed past 400,000 and kept climbing, past 500, past the top of even Ondrejek's estimate. Two collectors trading bids back and forth in increments that made the whole room go still each time. It closed, finally, at $710,000, to a private collector in Zurich who had, according to the auctioneer, been searching for an authentic example of Marek's methods for over a decade without success. Coastal Trust Bank received a cashier's check for the full mortgage balance 11 days later. Skye delivered it in person, not because it was necessary, but because she wanted to watch Nolan Braithwaite's face when she handed it across his desk. He didn't say much. He processed the payment, printed a receipt, and told her in a flat voice that her account was now closed and in good standing. Skye thanked him, told him to give her regards to Desmond, and walked out of that bank for the last time with her shoulders back in a way they hadn't been in 14 months. She kept the journal. She kept the case, empty now. The violin gone to a collector who Voss said would treat it with the reverence Osric would have wanted, and she kept Osric's tools exactly where they hung on the pegboard, outlined in pencil, undisturbed. What she changed was the shed itself. Over the following spring, Skye had the false wall taken down for good, the compartment left open and empty, a reminder rather than a hiding place, and she began spending her evenings out there the way Osric once had, except with a sketch pad instead of a chisel, teaching herself to paint the boats down at the marina, the ones Osric used to fix, in the fading light that used to belong only to him. With part of what remained after the mortgage and the debts and the taxes on the sale, Skye set aside a fund she named after Anton Merrick, though she'd never met the man, to help young tradespeople in coastal Maine afford the tools and apprenticeships that ambition alone couldn't buy. Julian Voss agreed to help her run it, reviewing applications each year from teenagers who reminded him, he said, of a stubborn boy who once showed up at a garage in Bosnia's shadow and refused to leave until someone taught him something real. 6 months after the auction, Skye stood in front of a small gathering at the County Historical Society, where she donated the journal itself, along with photographs of the violin and a short written account of Osric's 7 years of secret work. Corinne Achterberg, her neighbor of 9 years, sat in the front row, along with a handful of townspeople who had known Osric only as the man who fixed their boat engines and never once suspected what he built after dark. He never told anyone, Skye said to the room, not because he didn't trust people, but because he wanted this to be finished before it was believed. He spent years failing quietly so that when it was done, it would be real. I think about that a lot now. How many people spend their whole lives building something in private, hoping it reaches the person it's meant for before it's too late to matter? She thought, standing there, about the note in the cedar box, about the key that opened both a door and a drawer, about 15 years of a marriage she thought she understood completely, and the humbling discovery that even the people we know best can be holding something we've never been given the chance to see. Osric hadn't kept the secret to deceive her. He'd kept it because he wanted to hand her something whole, finished, undeniable, rather than years of uncertain progress and the fear that it might all come to nothing. Skye still paints in the shed most evenings, the same bare bulb overhead, the same smell of cedar in the walls, though sawdust has given way to the smell of oil paint and turpentine now. Some nights she takes the empty case down from its shelf and opens it, just to look at the velvet lining where the violin once rested, and remembers the sound Osric described in his journal. The single badly played note that he said sounded old in a way that had nothing to do with age. Love, she has come to believe, sometimes works exactly that way. Quiet for years, unfinished for years, and then, all at once, revealed in full, exactly when it's needed most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.